Very good morning to you. You're watching Sky News Breakfast. Our top stories. Well, Sky News understands the government is preparing to scrap the northern leg of the HS2 rail link, with an announcement to be made next week. It now appears the line will end at Birmingham instead of going through to Manchester. The Metropolitan Police says a number of firearms officers have handed in their weapons after one of their colleagues was charged with the murder of Chris Cabot. Labour claim that Rishi Sunak's energy U-turn will cost tenants an extra £500 a year. Police in Blackpool have launched a murder investigation after a woman was found with multiple injuries. The victim has been named as Alison Dodds. Greater Manchester has become the first area across the country to bring buses back under public control in nearly 40 years. And the Liberal Democrats Party conference is underway in Bournemouth, with the Lib Dems deputy leader saying the party has a huge opportunity to take seats off the Conservatives. Well, in a moment, we'll discuss the papers with my lovely guests here, but let's take a look at what is making the front pages. And the Telegraph says the Prime Minister could be about to scrap the second half of HS2 railway line after a shock increase in its estimated costs. Well, the Observer has the same story and says Rishi Sunak is facing a massive backlash from senior Tories over the potential U-turn. The Express says the PM is considering a raft of radical policy announcements. This is designed to put space between himself and the Labour leader as both parties eye up the looming general election. And the Sunday Times leads on one of those potential announcements. It says the Prime Minister is drawing up plans to slash inheritance tax. And the Mail on Sunday is also leading on one of Sunak's possible election plans. They say Sunak will not axe the triple lock on pensions after being warned it would be political suicide. Well, Strictly stars believe their studio is haunted and they're demanding a Ghostbuster. That's on the front page of The Sun. And how about The Star? Well, they're looking at scientists who are attempting to find methane gas produced by not cows, alien life forms in space. Now with us to review the papers, the senior political correspondent at the Daily Express, it's Christian Calgie, and PR and crisis management expert, it's Kevin Craig. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll sidestep The Sun and The Star for now. But we will start with the Observer, because a lot of the papers, of course, focusing on the potential announcement sometime next week that HS2, well, it will stop potentially at Birmingham and it won't go through to that main route in Manchester. And that's the front page of the Observer. Kevin.
Yes, and it's remarkable, really, because we may all not be aware that we are currently, our transport system is rated between, where is it, India and Kazakhstan in terms of, yes, in terms of our current levels. And this, before, Rishi became Prime Minister, he was very keen on major infrastructure projects. He talked about stability for industry. But now I think, and Christian will have a view on this as a political journalist, but to me it feels like that the government spin machine this weekend, if you look at the papers, they have been on coffee, Lucozade, Diet Coke, they are pumped. And they are, the Sundays are full of it. And they've obviously been sitting down thinking, how can we get collective amnesia foisted on the British population to make them forget we're in charge and redefine this election? And HS2, I think, is in the firing line.
Well, Rishi Sunak, Christian, he's had a lot of flack from Boris Johnson on this, from David Cameron. So potentially, a lot of senior Tories that are a bit miffed off.
Well, I think he's threatening a lot of Tory PM legacies with this, because both Boris and David Cameron put their stamp on it. The problem really is that it looks particularly bad to be cutting infrastructure. You know, not only when the Prime Minister is beset with a number of really constant headlines about his use of helicopters and private jets, not least when the rest of the public infrastructure is crumbling, and also, of course, ahead of Tory conference in Manchester.
Well, that's it.
Which
The announcement couldn't be made, could it, in
really
Manchester, because that would be political suicide.
I don't think it's going to be, you know, it's still going to be political euthanasia happening a week before Manchester conference. I think this is interesting, you know, because obviously the government is constantly saying we're getting inflation under control, but this is really being pushed because of inflationary measures. Now, Boris Johnson originally cut HS2, slashed the Leeds branch because they were concerned that the overall cost was going to go over 100 billion. They did that, and now new inflation means that once again it's going to go over 100 billion. So they're now having to cut the Manchester branch, and ultimately this is one of those political projects which isn't just about the rail infrastructure and the speed of the trains. It's also fundamentally a symbol of what Britain is in 2023. And one of the key problems here, you know, I'd be much more comfortable about this if they were pausing the Manchester branch in order to have a ground-up review of why Britain's infrastructure costs so much more than other countries. There was a really good paper from a think tank, centre-right think tank, a couple of weeks ago showing just how much more, you know, roads and tunnels and trains and housing cost in Britain, partly because of the ability to so easily object to these infrastructure. I mean, there was a fantastic example recently of one local community that forced a couple of, you know, HS2 to go underground, under the hills for a couple of miles because they didn't want to see the train lines. Now, that isn't sustainable. And if we ever want to build infrastructure, we've got to change our planning.
Well, it's going to be a big kick in the teeth, isn't it, for those who have invested in Manchester in anticipation of HS2. You ditch it, you're wasting money. You go ahead with it, it's a big deal, isn't it, really? That's a problem.
It is, you're quite right, Leah. But, you know, British industry is absolutely perplexed at this Prime Minister who, before he gets elected, well, in speech marks, because he was chosen, anointed by the tiny number of Tory party members, he was always talked about the import of investment in our transport infrastructure. And now, with the Tories at 44%, sorry, the Tories at 24%, which I'm thinking for some Christian, the Tories at 24% against Labour 44%, with, I think, less than a year, this is desperate.
Well, this is it, isn't it? As we lead up to a general election, it's all about how leaders come across. You'll know lots about, you know, positioning and PR on that front. But in the Express, Christian, it's all focusing, isn't it, on the leaders really setting about their agenda, let's say, whether it's 7 bins, whether it's regulating
nonsense
budgets, you know.
7 mythical bins.
I think the legislation makes it quite clear that 7 bins was an issue. I think, you know, the Express here includes a list, a bullet point of 3 other issues that Tory MPs want the Prime Minister to focus on. And those are scrapping the BBC licence fee, pulling out of the European Convention on Human Rights if the Supreme Court fails to approve the Rwanda deportations, and opening more grammar schools. Now, that's a heck of a wish list.
Christian, do you think, as a man who's in this newspaper, do you think that the voters out there after 13 years are saying, do you know what, I tell you what I want this government to do, they've got to sort the BBC licence fee out, mate?
Well, I think I'm not sure that there are certain things here that could be vote winners, and we'll get on to inheritance tax later. There's some stuff here that might be focus groups, might not be, and there's clearly other stuff here which is almost a sort of, a political will and testament to the Conservative Party after 13 years of power, and it's almost, you know, can we get these sort of ideological things over the line before we're booted out for a decade, right? That's partly what the consideration is here. Now, ECHR, I imagine that could possibly be in a manifesto. BBC licence fee, now they've left that particularly late, and grammar schools, I'd be surprised if that happened.
But with the cost of living crisis, there will be those voices that say, you know, we can't afford it. And the media landscape is changing all the time. But you're right to say, you know, the ordinary voter will be thinking about, actually, how am I going to pay my electricity bill? How do I afford the shop? These are the issues that don't seem to be
They will be. Well, I suppose
discussed as much.
Yeah, but the problem is that the largest part of that is inflation, right?
Yeah.
And the government's announced what it's doing on inflation. That is an issue of time. That is not something that new announcements can necessarily improve. And I think what the public are thinking is, yes, we know both the parties are saying almost the same thing on inflation. Yes, we've got to stop the boats and all that. What they want to hear is almost the rest of the flesh on the bones. And at the moment, based on these front pages, I can now list a lot more Tory policies than I can Labour policies. And I think that is something the public are also going to consider is, you know, what's the offer here? And this is the Tory offer.
Well, Kevin, in the Sunday Times, inheritance tax is something that the Conservatives are protecting, and, you know, that's going to be a big one as we lead into...
Absolutely, and I think, you know, is the British public waiting to hear and all, less than, you know, well under 5% of them affected by inheritance tax? You can basically inherit comfortably £1 million if you organise it correctly. And I think Chris makes a good point actually about where are Labour's policies, but actually Labour's set out the broad direction of travel, but every time Keir Starmer comes out, who I happen to, I'm desperate to win, by the way, just in case you didn't realise, every time he comes out with a policy, okay, the government with the life belt around them nicks it. So, you know, and I don't blame them, right? I don't blame them. So that's why Labour's holding fires, giving you direction of travel, NHS crime, G7 economy. Anyway, inheritance tax. Do this again. Why is this a priority, right? You know, and I guess the answer is going to be, well, loads of pensioners are theoretical property millionaires. It could go up from under 5% of people to over 10% of people for whom inheritance tax makes a real difference. And it's mood music, you know, money in your pocket. Yeah. But I just think, you know, after 13 years, you know, are people going to think less about that inheritance tax pledge and more about mortgages costing 220 quid a month more?
Well, the other issue, Christian, you make a good point, Kevin. The other issue is that, you know, Rishi Sunak this week really ripping up those net zero plans that were in place and sort of dialing back and really saying, look, I'm looking after you, the British public, and net zero isn't achievable or proportionate or fair. And the Sunday Telegraph really focusing on that too.
Yes, and I also think, by the way, there's a poll in the Sunday Express which says around 7 in 10 voters back the electric car move, which I think feels about right. Now, the Sunday Telegraph has a very important story because one of the things that, you know, me and my friends talk about the most is the cost of housing. And, you know, very unfortunately, Rishi Sunak is sort of absolutely defending the Green Belt. Yeah. You know, that's a real thing for him. But to mitigate that, what was offered a few weeks ago was a very important change to some old EU rules about nutrient neutrality, which is to do with ensuring that rivers aren't more polluted by new houses. Now, the Tories argue not only is this getting in the way of house building, but it's also actually quite an ineffective environmental rule. And what they were going to do is abolish these laws and pair them with new monitoring, new environmental protections to improve the quality of rivers at the same time. Now, the problem was that the government only came up with this idea very late into one of its bills that was going through the House of Lords. The problem with that is if it's not introduced by the House of Commons and the House of Lords vote it down, it doesn't ping-pong back to MPs. So it was voted down by what I would describe as a cabal of environmental NIMBYs, you know, it was back to square one. Now, what the government is going to do is going to apparently reintroduce the proposals in the King's Speech, which would be a much more solid footing and potentially get it through Parliament. The thing I would flag from this story is the admission that Sunak is going to essentially have to shelve another piece of legislation in order to fit this in, and that is, you know, I was going to mention back when we were just talking about inheritance tax. A lot of these proposals are not going to happen before the election.
Well, that's the thing.
There's very
Whether
little
it's smoking,
time.
You know,
Smoking, grammar schools, ECHR, inheritance tax. So this is one thing that I think could get done before the election. The question is, what is going to be shelved? Is it going to be trans guidance in schools, which was proposed earlier. Is that going to lead to a backbench revolt? We don't know, but I think that is something interesting to think about, is of all the things we've talked about this morning, what's actually going to be achievable between now and the election?
Oh, it's going to really, really be so interesting to watch this and all of those pledges. Kevin, Christian, thank you so much for now. We'll be catching up in the next hour, but thank you very much.